It was a cold morning in New York City, with the early winter wind sweeping through the bustling streets. People hurried along, scarves pulled tightly around their necks, oblivious to everything but their own destinations. Outside an impressive law office on 53rd Street, Daniel Brooks, a prominent corporate lawyer, was stepping out, reviewing some last-minute notes on a high-stakes merger he was leading. As he closed his briefcase and glanced at his watch, he noticed a small figure standing quietly nearby. She couldn't have been more than 9 or 10 years old, dressed in a thin coat that seemed inadequate for the biting cold. She clutched a worn, brown leather briefcase in her hands, watching him intently with wide, serious eyes. "Sir," she said, her voice barely audible above the street noise. Daniel looked down, surprised that this young girl was addressing him. She held up the briefcase with a determined expression. "I think this belongs to you." He took a closer look and immediately recognized the briefcase. It was one he had frantically searched for that very morning, a briefcase containing critical documents for his merger case. He took it from her with a mixture of relief and astonishment. "Thank you," he managed, still trying to process how she had found it. Where did you find this?" "In the alley behind the building," she replied simply, her tone serious and composed beyond her years. Daniel felt a pang of discomfort as he observed her too thin coat and the way her fingers were red from the cold. Realizing the significance of her honesty, he asked, "Is there anything I can do for you? A reward, maybe?" He expected her to ask for money, maybe food, but the girl surprised him. Her expression softened for a brief moment before she fixed him with a resolute gaze. "Help my grandmother find her family," she replied, her voice strong and unwavering. Daniel was taken aback. This wasn't the answer he had expected, and for a moment, he found himself at a loss for words. Daniel stared at the girl, feeling an unexpected weight in her request. He looked around, feeling strangely exposed as if they stood alone on an empty street instead of in the middle of Manhattan. The air between them hung heavy as he processed what she'd asked. He crouched down to her eye level, clutching the reclaimed briefcase. "Your grandmother? Find her family? What do you mean by that?" The girl met his gaze, unwavering. "She lost her family years ago," she said, her tone matter of fact, but he could sense an underlying sadness. "She talks about them sometimes, about how she's been looking for them her whole life." Her eyes, a striking blue against her pale face, softened just a bit, as though remembering something painful. "She's all I have left." Daniel felt a knot tighten in his chest. This wasn't just a simple request, it was a plea. "What's your name?" he asked, shifting from his usual brisk tone to something softer. "Sophie," she replied, wrapping her small arms around herself as another gust of wind blew through the street. Daniel took note of the tired look in her eyes, a weariness that seemed far beyond her years. He couldn't help but feel a strange mix of compassion and curiosity. "All right, Sophie," he said slowly, glancing briefly at the briefcase she'd returned to him. "I'll help you, but I'll need to know more about your grandmother. Do you think I could meet her?" Sophie nodded immediately, as though she had expected this. "She'll be home," she said, starting to turn as if he'd already agreed to follow her. Daniel hesitated. He had 1,000 things to do, pressing calls to make and meetings to attend, but something about Sophie's straightforwardness tugged at him. "Let me call someone first," he said, stepping to the side. He pulled out his phone, punched in a number, and waited as it rang. "Stacy," he said once his assistant picked up, "reschedule my morning. I'll be tied up with something important." There was a pause on the other end, but he didn't elaborate. Hanging up, he turned back to Sophie. "Lead the way." Sophie walked briskly, her tiny frame slicing through the crowds that paid her no mind. Daniel followed, a tall, well-dressed man, starkly out of place as he trailed this child through parts of the city he rarely ventured. They turned down several streets, the familiar gleam of office towers and upscale shops gradually giving way to older buildings and weathered storefronts. He glanced around, seeing the city in a way he hadn't in years. Eventually, they reached a narrow, unassuming building. Sophie led him up the steps, her worn shoes making soft taps on the stone. Inside, the air was warmer but smelled faintly of mildew and old wallpaper. She climbed the stairs 2 at a time, with Daniel right behind her, still trying to process the strange turn his morning had taken. Finally, they reached a door near the end of the hall. Sophie knocked, 3 quick raps, and a frail voice called out from inside. "Come in, Sophie." Sophie opened the door, and they stepped into a small, dimly lit apartment. The smell of tea and lavender filled the air. In the center of the room, in an armchair by the window, sat an older woman wrapped in a wool shawl. Her silver hair was neatly pinned back, her face marked with deep lines that told a story of hardship and resilience. She looked up, her eyes a soft, faded blue that mirrored Sophie's. "Gran, this is the man I told you about," Sophie announced, her voice carrying a note of pride as if she'd just performed a great feat. The woman's gaze shifted to Daniel, her expression a mixture of curiosity and quiet strength. "Good morning, sir," she said, her voice warm but edged with caution. "I'm Margaret. Thank you for helping Sophie." Daniel extended a hand, which Margaret took with a surprisingly firm grip. "I owe her the thanks," he replied. "She returned something very important to me." They both sat, with Sophie standing protectively close to her grandmother's side. "She mentioned that you're looking for family?" he began carefully. Margaret's eyes flickered with something unspoken. A shadow of memories, perhaps. She folded her hands in her lap, her gaze distant. "Yes, I lost touch with them many years ago," she said softly. "Life took its turns, as it always does, and I had to let them go." She hesitated, glancing at Sophie. "But there are things I wish to put right, things I want Sophie to know." Sophie reached for her grandmother's hand, holding it tightly, as if to show she understood. Daniel could feel the sadness in the room, but he also sensed something deeper, an unbroken spirit. He shifted in his seat, sensing the trust they were placing in him. "I can help," he said gently, "but I'll need as many details as you can give me. Names, places, anything that might help me find them." Margaret looked at him, and in that moment, her expression softened. "There were so many things I thought I'd left behind," she murmured, almost to herself. Then, gathering her strength, she nodded. "I'll tell you everything I can, Mr. Brooks. Everything I can remember." Daniel sat across from Margaret, leaning forward as she began to recount memories that had clearly been hidden away for years. Her voice trembled at first, then grew steadier as the fragments of her past came together. Sophie, still holding her grandmother's hand, listened quietly, her expression intense, as though every word was something precious. Margaret's story began in a small town upstate. "We lived simply," she said, her gaze distant, as if she could see it all right in front of her. "My family worked the land, small vegetable gardens mostly, and my father ran a modest repair shop for the townsfolk." She paused, looking out the small window where light slanted in, highlighting her gentle wrinkles. "I was the youngest of 4, and my brothers, well, they were always getting into trouble. But they were family, my everything." As she spoke, her hand trembled slightly, and Sophie tightened her hold. Daniel noticed the quiet strength between them. There was something remarkable about this bond, as though Margaret's pain and Sophie's devotion kept them connected even in the silence. One by one, my brothers left home. War called them away, and soon it was just my parents and me. After a while, I left too, though my reasons were different. I was young and headstrong, wanting to escape that quiet town and find something more for myself. Her voice softened, tinged with regret. "But life has a way of humbling us, doesn't it?" She fell quiet, her face etched with memories both cherished and painful. Daniel could see how her departure from that life, that small town, weighed on her still. Margaret took a deep breath, her voice growing quieter. "I left when I met a man from the city. He was charismatic, or at least, I thought so then. We moved here to Manhattan, and I lost touch with my family. I always thought it would be temporary, that one day I'd go back, but he kept us moving, and soon, well, my life just kept going forward." The room was filled with a solemn silence. Daniel looked at Sophie, who was watching her grandmother with a fierce focus, as though seeing her in a new light. "What happened to him?" Daniel asked gently, sensing there was more to the story. Margaret lowered her head, her voice barely a whisper. "He left, suddenly, and I had nothing. It was just Sophie's mother and me. She reached out, almost as if touching a ghost. I tried to go back to my family, to find them, but when I returned to that town, it was like they had vanished. The house was empty, and no one could tell me where they'd gone. It was like they'd left and left no trace. Daniel frowned, understanding now the weight behind Sophie's request. Margaret hadn't simply lost touch with her family. She had been cut off from them entirely, left to piece her life back together on her own. Do you know if your family kept in touch with anyone in town? Or if there were any relatives who might still be nearby? He asked, leaning forward. Margaret shook her head slowly. There was an aunt, my father's sister. She lived in the next county over. If she's still alive, her voice trailed off. I don't even know if she'd remember me, or want to. Daniel looked at her, struck by how life had swept her so far away from everyone and everything she'd ever known. He realized the enormity of the task she was asking of him, but he also saw Sophie's pleading eyes, the quiet determination in her young face. She was standing by her grandmother's side, her eyes a mixture of hope and resilience. I'll start with that, he said, looking at both of them. I'll go upstate. I'll talk to anyone I can find who remembers your family. He glanced down at the briefcase she'd returned to him, feeling an odd sense that his gratitude extended beyond the returned documents. I'll need to go through records, maybe find out where they might have moved. It'll take time. Margaret gave a slight nod, her eyes misting over with a glimmer of hope. Thank you, she whispered, her voice so soft it was barely audible. Sophie stepped closer to Daniel, looking up at him with a resolve that seemed far too mature for her years. You'll find them, she said, as though the certainty of her words alone could make it true. For the first time in years, Daniel felt something shift in him, as though this encounter with Sophie and Margaret was drawing him back to something he had long since let go of. A time when people weren't just clients, and tasks weren't just part of a job. I'll do everything I can, he said, his voice firm. He stood, and they walked him to the door. As he left, he felt their eyes on him, a strange sense of expectation lingering in the air. The city seemed a bit different as he stepped back onto the busy street, charged with a purpose that felt both familiar and new. The following morning, Daniel found himself on the road, heading north out of Manhattan. He hadn't set foot in the upstate town where Margaret had grown up in years, but there was a certain feeling he couldn't shake, a sense that his purpose this time went far beyond his usual tasks. The landscape began to change as he drove. The towering buildings gave way to rolling hills and quiet, tree-lined roads that wound through small towns dotted with old, weather-beaten houses and mom-and-pop stores. He felt a strange pang of nostalgia for the simplicity of it all, the slower rhythm of these places, so unlike his world of high-stakes deals and endless meetings. By noon, he had reached the town Margaret had described, a quaint, somewhat forgotten place. Its main street was lined with a few modest shops, a bakery, a hardware store, a small cafe. He parked his car and took a slow breath, letting the small-town air fill his lungs. It felt strange, like stepping back in time, into a place where everyone knew each other's business and where strangers stood out. He made his way to the local records office, a small building tucked between the post office and a modest grocery store. Inside, the room was quiet, save for the ticking of an old clock on the wall. An older woman behind the counter looked up as he entered, her gaze curious. "Good afternoon," Daniel greeted, keeping his voice soft in the silence of the space. "I'm hoping you might be able to help me find some records on a family that used to live around here." She raised a thin eyebrow, glancing at him over her reading glasses. "We don't get many folks looking up records, especially on old families," she said with a mild smile. "Who are you trying to find?" "The name's Margaret Atwood," he said, watching her closely for a sign of recognition. "Well, her maiden name. Actually, she had 3 brothers. They lived here in the 50s, but from what I understand, they moved away." Suddenly, the woman's face softened, and she nodded slowly, as though he'd just spoken a language she hadn't heard in years. "The Atwoods. I remember them. Lived in a little house just off Maple Street. Nice folk, hardworking, but they left all at once. People here never did find out why." She pursed her lips thoughtfully. "There were rumors, of course, that the father took a job in another state, or that they had to sell the house after something happened, Daniel felt a glimmer of hope. At least someone remembered them. Do you have any idea where they went? She hesitated, glancing down at the counter, her fingers tracing the edge of a dusty record book. They left some things behind in the old house. A neighbor packed up what was left and took it to the church. Maybe you'll find something there, or at least someone who can tell you more. Daniel thanked her, taking a few more directions and heading toward the church she had mentioned. As he walked, he couldn't help but wonder what could have caused Margaret's family to leave so abruptly, without so much as a word to those they left behind. It felt like a puzzle with too many missing pieces. The church was small and unassuming, its stone walls showing the wear of time. Inside, the air was cool and quiet, filled with the scent of aged wood and old books. A man in his 70s was sitting in the last pew, reading a Bible. When Daniel approached, the man looked up, eyes sharp with curiosity. "Afternoon," Daniel said, nodding respectfully. "I'm looking for information on the Atwood family. I was told that some of their belongings might have been left here years ago." The man closed his Bible, a glimmer of recognition flashing in his eyes. "You're talking about the Atwoods? Haven't heard that name in years. They were good folks. Quiet, kept to themselves, mostly. But," he stopped, a shadow crossing his face. "Their leaving was sudden. A lot of people had questions." Daniel leaned in, sensing that he was close to something important. "Do you remember anything specific? Anything about where they might have gone?" The man looked thoughtful, his gaze distant as though piecing together memories he hadn't touched in years. "There was talk around town back then, something about Margaret's older brother, Samuel. He was mixed up in some trouble, left town in the middle of the night, and soon after, the rest of the family followed." Daniel's mind raced, piecing together the story. A brother who might have left under suspicious circumstances, a family forced to leave without a trace. This was more than he'd anticipated, more than Margaret had probably known herself. "Do you know where he might have gone? Or if he ever came back?" The man shook his head. "Not a clue. If anyone knows, it'd be old Ben. He's the one who took what was left in their house, packed it up, and stored it in the church basement. You'll find him at the house he grew up in, still on Maple Street." Daniel thanked the man, feeling the weight of the mystery deepen. He headed back down the quiet main street, passing modest homes until he came upon the address the man had given him. The house was quaint and well-kept, though it bore the marks of age. He knocked on the door, and it was soon opened by a wiry old man with keen eyes that immediately assessed him. "You're looking for something," the man said, his voice rough but not unkind. "Yes, my name is Daniel Brooks. I'm here on behalf of Margaret Atwood. She was hoping to find something left behind by her family. Something that might lead her to them." The man nodded slowly, his face softening at the mention of Margaret. "That little girl, well, she's not so little anymore, I suppose," he murmured, then stepped aside. "Come on in." Daniel entered, and the man led him to a small, dusty room at the back of the house. He rummaged through an old box on a shelf, finally pulling out a small, faded notebook bound in leather. He handed it to Daniel with a kind of reverence. "This was left behind. Never could bring myself to throw it out. It was her mother's, if I remember right." Daniel opened the notebook carefully, the pages filled with neat, faded handwriting. Entries from a mother documenting her children's lives, their small achievements, dreams, and hopes. As he read, Daniel felt the weight of what he held. This relic of a family's history, a piece of Margaret's world that had been lost to time. And somewhere in those entries, in those words written long ago, he felt certain that a piece of the mystery lay waiting to be uncovered. Daniel sat in his car, holding the fragile notebook in his hands, as though it were a piece of glass that could shatter with one wrong move. The afternoon light had begun to soften into early evening, casting long shadows across the quiet town. He flipped through the notebook carefully, each page filled with words that had once meant the world to a mother, whose life revolved around her children's smallest achievements and dreams. Some of the pages were filled with notes about Margaret, some about her brothers, but there was one recurring name that caught his eye: Samuel. Samuel had been the eldest, and though there was warmth in the way his mother wrote about him, Daniel sensed something darker in her words. There were entries noting her worry over Samuel's choice of friends, his increasing moodiness, his arguments with his father. On one page, under a hastily written entry, a dried, fragile flower petal was pressed. A keepsake, perhaps from a happier time, its meaning long faded. Daniel's fingers lingered on it, and he wondered how many times Margaret's mother had returned to these pages, rereading them to keep memories of her son alive. The last entry dedicated to Samuel was brief, almost hurried. Samuel left tonight. Said it was for the best. I hope he finds peace. I pray for him. No date, no further explanation. Just a few cryptic words that left Daniel with more questions than answers. He could almost feel the heaviness of those words, as though they carried the weight of years of worry and silent heartache. Taking a deep breath, Daniel closed the notebook, glancing back at old Ben's house. The old man had watched him leave with a somber look, perhaps realizing that the notebook he had kept all these years might finally reveal secrets that the Atwoods had carried with them into their abrupt departure. Daniel wondered what Ben knew, if there were more details he hadn't shared. But something told him that the notebook held all the answers he would get from this town. As he started the car and pulled back onto the main road, Daniel's mind whirred with possibilities. The pieces were beginning to form a picture. A family fractured, a son who had left under unclear circumstances, and a mother who had never given up hope for him. And then there was Margaret, who had walked away from all of it, only to find herself estranged, searching decades later for what she'd left behind. Sophie, too young to understand fully, was now at the heart of it all, carrying forward her grandmother's legacy of longing and connection. He drove back toward the city, the miles passing in a blur as he considered his next move. He knew this wasn't the end of his search. It was barely the beginning. But he had to return to Margaret, to show her what he'd found, and to see if her memories might help him untangle the web that had left her family scattered. He felt a strange sense of urgency, as if each passing moment took them further from the truth. By the time he reached Margaret's apartment, the sky had darkened, and the city lights glowed against the dusky blue. He climbed the narrow stairwell and knocked on the door, his mind still turning over the details he had uncovered. The door opened to reveal Sophie, her wide eyes lighting up as she saw him. "Did you find them?" she asked immediately, her voice full of hope. "Not yet," he said gently, smiling to soften the disappointment. "But I found something that might help us." He held up the notebook, and her eyes widened with curiosity. "Gran," she called, turning back into the apartment. "Mr. Brooks found something." Margaret appeared a moment later, moving slowly, her face a mixture of anticipation and worry. Daniel noticed the slight tremor in her hands as she reached for the notebook, her eyes scanning the worn cover as though it were a long-lost friend. "Where did you find this?" she whispered, her voice catching. "I thought it was lost forever. A man in town kept it all these years. He remembered your family and thought it might still be useful one day." He watched her face as she opened the notebook, her gaze softening as she took in the familiar handwriting, the delicate script that had been her mother's. Margaret sank into a chair, her eyes fixed on the pages. "My mother," she murmured, brushing her fingers over the faded ink. She wrote everything down, every little thing. She believed memories should be preserved. I suppose that's why I kept searching, even when I felt like giving up. She would have wanted me to. Daniel nodded, his gaze drawn to the way she clutched the notebook like a lifeline. "There are mentions of your brother Samuel," he said gently. "It seems he left under difficult circumstances, and shortly after, the rest of the family followed." Margaret's face fell, her expression a mix of sadness and guilt. "Samuel, he was troubled. He was always restless, searching for something, though he could never say what. When he left, my parents were devastated. They tried everything to find him, but he disappeared. I think that's why they left. They couldn't stay in that town, not without him." She paused, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I didn't know he was in trouble," she whispered, her voice almost a plea. "I thought he just moved on, like so many others. But I didn't know." Sophie moved closer, slipping her small hand into her grandmother's, offering silent support. Daniel watched the two of them, a mix of emotions swelling in his chest. He felt more driven than ever to give them the closure they needed, to reunite this family in whatever way was possible, even if it was only through memory. There's a chance that someone might remember him, someone in the city who might have known him after he left, Daniel said, his voice firm. People don't just disappear. Not completely. Margaret looked up at him, a flicker of hope returning to her eyes. You really think you could find something? He nodded. I'm not giving up until I do. I owe that much to both of you. Margaret's eyes softened with gratitude. Thank you, Mr. Brooks. You don't know what this means to us. As they sat together, the weight of her story hanging in the air, Daniel felt a renewed sense of purpose. This was no longer just a search for answers. It was a journey to reclaim a piece of a life that had been stolen away by time and circumstance. He left Margaret's apartment that evening with a determination that had nothing to do with his usual sense of duty. This wasn't about contracts or deadlines. It was about people, about lives that had been left behind and connections waiting to be restored. The next morning, Daniel arrived at his office earlier than usual, a plan already forming in his mind. He would reach out to a contact who specialized in tracking down people through public records, someone who could comb through documents and databases with the kind of persistence and expertise he needed for this job. He knew it would take time, that it might not even lead to the answers they sought, but he was willing to try. Over the next several days, Daniel and his contact poured through records, tracing every possible lead. They examined city registries, birth and death certificates, and addresses that might connect to Samuel or any of his family members. The process was exhausting, frustrating at times, and often led to dead ends. But with each small discovery, Daniel felt a step closer to understanding the tangled path that had separated Margaret from her family. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, his contact called with a breakthrough. I think I found something, she said, her voice crackling through the line with barely contained excitement. An address linked to a Samuel Atwood. It's an old listing, but it might be a start. Daniel's pulse quickened. He thanked her, quickly gathering his things, and set out for the address she had given him. As he approached the neighborhood, he felt a strange sense of foreboding. The area was run down, the buildings worn and tired, but there was an undeniable energy about the place, a sense that life had once thrived here, even if it had been harsh. He found the address, an old, weathered building with peeling paint and cracked windows. Knocking on the door, he was met with silence, and his hope faltered. But then a voice from behind him spoke. Looking for someone? A woman's voice, raspy and cautious. Daniel turned to see an elderly woman watching him from the stoop across the street. I'm looking for Samuel Atwood, he said, trying to keep his tone calm. The woman squinted, then nodded slowly. He lived here a long time ago, but he's gone now. Disappointment washed over him, but he pressed on. Do you know where he went? The woman shook her head. I remember him, though. Kept to himself mostly, but he was a good man. Helped me with my groceries once when I was young and had a bad fall. It's funny, you never know who leaves an impression on you until they're gone. Daniel thanked her, his mind whirring. He didn't have all the answers yet, but he was closer, and he knew that every piece, every memory, would be a gift to Margaret and Sophie. He returned to New York that evening, feeling both the weight of the journey and the satisfaction of the progress he had made. It wasn't over yet, but he could feel the end in sight. After weeks of tracking down leads and piecing together bits of information, Daniel felt he was finally onto something. He'd managed to confirm that Samuel Atwood had lived in the old building the woman had pointed out. Though Samuel had vanished without leaving a clear trace, Daniel's contact had recently uncovered something startling in the archives. Samuel had a daughter, Sophie's mother. The realization struck him with the weight of a revelation. It meant that Sophie was, in fact, the direct link to the family Margaret had been searching for all these years, and Daniel couldn't shake the sense that there was even more to uncover. As he drove through the dimly lit streets, making his way back to Margaret's apartment to share what he'd learned, he felt a weight in his chest, a mix of urgency and trepidation. The connection he'd found was a gift, certainly, but it came with layers of questions and implications that he wasn't entirely sure he could answer. And yet, he knew he owed Margaret and Sophie whatever truth he could provide. When he finally reached Margaret's building, he took a deep breath, steeling himself before stepping out of the car and climbing the stairs to her apartment. As he approached the door, he could hear voices inside. Margaret's soft, comforting tone, followed by Sophie's high-pitched, hopeful one. He hesitated, feeling the gravity of the news he was about to share, then knocked firmly. The door opened, and Sophie's face appeared, her eyes brightening immediately when she saw him. "Mr. Brooks, did you find out anything?" she asked, her voice brimming with hope. Daniel nodded, his gaze shifting to Margaret, who stood behind Sophie, her hands clasped together tightly. Her eyes held a mixture of hope and apprehension, as though she were bracing herself for the worst. "May I come in?" he asked gently, and Margaret stepped aside, nodding. The room was filled with a tense silence as Daniel took a seat across from them, Sophie settling close to her grandmother, her small hand resting on Margaret's knee. "I've been doing some digging," he began, his voice steady but soft, "and I found something significant. Margaret, it turns out Samuel had a daughter." Sophie's mother. Margaret's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with shock. "A daughter? Samuel had a family," she whispered, her voice trembling as though she could hardly believe what she was hearing. "Yes," Daniel replied, leaning forward, his hands clasped together as he continued. "It seems that after he left town, he eventually settled here in New York. He met someone, and together they had a daughter. That daughter became Sophie's mother." He looked at Sophie, who seemed to be following along, her expression curious but not fully comprehending the depth of what he was saying. Margaret's shoulders slumped, and she sank back into her chair, her eyes unfocused as she processed the revelation. "All this time, I had family here, right here in this city," she murmured, her voice heavy with emotion. She turned to Sophie, a softness in her gaze that seemed to deepen with the realization. "That means you're part of them, Sophie. You're part of the family I've been looking for all these years." Sophie's face lit up, a wide smile spreading across her lips. "So we did find them. We're not alone, Gran. We have family," she exclaimed, her voice filled with a childlike wonder that Daniel couldn't help but smile at. But Margaret's expression remained solemn, her gaze distant. "I never knew. I thought he had vanished, that he was gone forever. And yet, he was here. All this time," she whispered, almost to herself, as though speaking the words out loud might somehow make them real. Daniel reached out, his hand resting gently on hers. "Margaret, I know this must be a lot to take in, and there's more." He hesitated, choosing his words carefully, not wanting to overwhelm her. "I learned that Samuel struggled a lot after he left home. He had trouble finding work, and he moved around a lot before he eventually came here. It seems he kept a low profile, maybe to protect his family, maybe even to protect you." Margaret closed her eyes, her face etched with pain and regret. "If only I had known," she murmured. "I would have looked harder. I would have done something." "Gran," Sophie whispered, placing a hand on her grandmother's arm, her small fingers gentle but firm. "It's okay. We found him now, didn't we?" Margaret opened her eyes, looking down at Sophie with a sad smile. "Yes, darling. We found him. Or at least, a part of him." She reached out, pulling Sophie close, her hand resting protectively on the back of her granddaughter's head. "You're all I have of him now," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "And you're more than enough." Daniel felt a pang in his chest, watching the two of them. He could see the love and resilience that bound them together, a bond that had survived years of uncertainty and separation. It was as though they had been carrying Samuel's legacy all along, without even knowing it. After a long moment of silence, Margaret looked up at Daniel, her eyes clear and determined. "Thank you, Mr. Brooks, for finding this, for giving us this piece of him back." Her voice was strong, filled with gratitude and a sense of closure that he hadn't seen in her before. But Daniel wasn't done. There was still one final question he needed to ask, one more piece of the puzzle that he hoped Margaret could help him understand. "Margaret," he said gently, "I know this is a lot, but I need to know if you remember anything else about why your family left town so suddenly. Anything about Samuel that might explain why he left the way he did." Margaret's face clouded, her brow furrowing as she searched her memory. "I remember. There was a fight, she said slowly, her voice hesitant as though dredging up memories she had long buried. Samuel had been in some trouble, though I never knew the full story. My father, he was furious with him. There were rumors in town, whispers that Samuel had done something serious. I don't know if it was true, but my parents were so ashamed. They didn't talk about it, didn't tell me anything more. She sighed, her gaze dropping to the floor. Maybe that's why he left, why he thought he couldn't stay. But I never believed those rumors. Samuel was complicated, yes, restless, but he was good, deep down. I wish I had tried harder to find him. Daniel felt a surge of empathy, recognizing the pain of someone who had been forced to live with unanswered questions for most of her life. He understood, now more than ever, that this was about more than just finding family. It was about reconciling with the past, about giving Margaret and Sophie a sense of peace they had long been denied. "I'll keep looking," he promised, his voice steady. "I'll see if I can find anything else about what happened back then, and I'll make sure you have the truth, no matter what it is." Margaret nodded, her gaze softening. "Thank you, Daniel," she said, using his first name for the first time. "Thank you for doing what I couldn't." He nodded, rising to leave. But before he could turn, Sophie reached out, her small hand grabbing onto his sleeve. "Are you going to leave us now, Mr. Brooks?" she asked, her voice filled with a quiet vulnerability that caught him off guard. Daniel looked down at her, feeling a warmth he hadn't expected. "Not yet, Sophie. There's still more to find. I'll be back soon. I promise." Sophie gave him a shy smile, releasing his sleeve, and as he turned to leave, he felt an unexpected sense of purpose, a drive that went beyond his usual commitment to a case. This wasn't about winning a legal battle or securing a merger. This was about healing a family, about finding answers that had been lost in the shadows of time. As he walked back to his car, he looked up at the stars, feeling a strange calm settle over him. He realized, in that moment, that this journey had changed him. It had reminded him of the things that mattered most. The connections we hold, the love we carry, and the ties that bind us, even when we think they're broken. He drove away with the notebook still in his pocket, its pages a testament to a family that had endured, to a past that had been waiting to be rediscovered. And as he headed back to the city, he knew he wouldn't rest until he had given Margaret and Sophie the closure they so desperately deserved. Daniel returned to his office the next day with a renewed resolve. His assistant, Stacy, noticed the change in his demeanor. He wasn't his usual brisk, preoccupied self. Instead, there was a quiet intensity about him, a look she couldn't quite place. "Stacy," he called, looking up from his desk, "I need you to pull every connection we have, every resource available, and put it into this family case. I want records, property deeds, any criminal records for Samuel Atwood, anything that could explain what happened to Margaret's family all those years ago." She raised her eyebrows, but didn't question him. Stacy had worked with Daniel long enough to recognize when something had personally touched him, and she could see that this was one of those rare cases. Within a few hours, she'd compiled a list of leads and arranged appointments with a few retired detectives who might remember old cases involving Samuel. She even set up an interview with a retired lawyer who'd handled property deeds in the town back in the 50s. Daniel appreciated her efficiency more than ever. As he looked through the reports she'd brought in, he felt like he was unearthing pieces of a puzzle that had long since been buried under layers of secrecy and shame. His first stop that day was an unremarkable house in Queens, where the retired detective, Frank Marino, now lived. Frank was in his 70s, with a lean build and sharp eyes that hadn't dulled with age. He invited Daniel in, nodding as Daniel explained the reason for his visit. "You're looking into a family case?" Frank asked, settling into his armchair. "Funny how those stick with you. Most cases they fade, but the family ones? Those linger. Do you remember anything about Samuel Atwood?" Daniel asked, leaning forward. "Or the Atwood family in general?" Frank scratched his chin thoughtfully. "I remember bits and pieces. This was back when I was still new on the force, not even a detective yet. The Atwoods, they were respectable folks, kept to themselves, hard-working." He paused, squinting as he tried to recall the details. There was something about the oldest son, Samuel, He got into some trouble. There were rumors, nothing proven, though. My old partner used to say Samuel was mixed up with some rough characters from the city. What kind of trouble? Daniel pressed. His curiosity piqued. Well, you didn't hear it from me, but there was a burglary a few towns over, not long before the family left town. Big deal, too. Word was that Samuel was involved, though nothing was ever proven. Frank leaned back, his gaze distant. After that, it was like the whole family just disappeared, vanished overnight. It was strange, even for those days. Nobody heard from them again. At least, not officially. Daniel absorbed this, understanding now why Margaret's family might have left so abruptly. Do you think Samuel left to protect his family? Frank considered this, then nodded slowly. I'd bet on it. Samuel wasn't a bad kid, from what I remember. Troubled, sure, but not evil. He might have gotten in over his head and thought the only way to save his family was to leave. The pieces began to fall into place in Daniel's mind. He thanked Frank and left, feeling as though he were drawing closer to understanding the full story. Next, he met with the retired lawyer Stacy had tracked down. The lawyer, an elderly gentleman named Harold Fisher, had once handled property deeds and small claims in that town and remembered the Atwoods well. Ah, the Atwoods. Yes, I remember them, he said, shaking Daniel's hand with a surprising amount of strength for his age. They had a small plot of land on the edge of town. Decent folks. But they left in a hurry, and I ended up handling the deed transfer when they sold the house. All done through a third party, of course. No one saw them again after that. Do you remember why they sold it? Daniel asked, hoping Harold could add more context. Harold gave a low chuckle. I always assumed it was the trouble with the son, Samuel. The town was small, and rumors had a way of growing faster than crops in that place. People said he'd left after an incident, something criminal, but I don't know the details. The shame alone could have been reason enough to go. Daniel felt a pang of sympathy for Margaret. To think that her family had been driven out by shame, by a scandal that might not have even been true, was a bitter truth. It explained why Margaret had been so certain Samuel couldn't have been guilty of anything truly terrible. She trusted her brother's goodness, but the town's judgment had overshadowed any innocence he might have had. That night, Daniel couldn't shake the weight of what he'd uncovered. Margaret's family had been splintered by the actions of others, by rumors and suspicion, and by a young man's mistakes, real or otherwise. But somewhere in the midst of it all, he was convinced there had been love, a love that Margaret and Sophie were now bound by, perhaps without even knowing the full story of where it had come from. He spent the next day organizing the notes, piecing together a timeline of Samuel's life after he left town. Records showed he had lived in various addresses around New York, most of them in working-class neighborhoods, suggesting that he'd had trouble keeping steady work. There was no sign of any wealth or criminal activity beyond the rumors that had followed him. By late afternoon, Daniel had one last name to follow up on, a man who had been a known associate of Samuel's from his early days in the city. The man, Tony Romano, was a mechanic who had once run with a rough crowd but had since left that life behind. Daniel tracked him down at a garage in Brooklyn, a modest place filled with the smell of motor oil and the sound of clanking metal. Tony, a burly man with tattooed arms and a deep, gravelly voice, looked Daniel over with wary eyes. "You a cop?" he asked, wiping his hands on a rack. "No, I'm a lawyer," Daniel replied, offering a small smile. "I'm trying to help the family of an old friend of yours, Samuel Atwood." Tony's expression softened slightly at the mention of Samuel. "Sammy, I remember him. It's been years. What's this about?" Daniel explained the story, watching as Tony's tough exterior melted away, replaced by a sadness that told him Tony still held some loyalty to his old friend. "Sammy got into trouble," Tony admitted, shaking his head. "But he wasn't a bad guy. Just unlucky. Made a few wrong choices, got in over his head with the wrong people. There was a job he got mixed up in, a burglary. He didn't plan it, didn't want to do it, but once you're in, you know? He was just trying to make enough money to get his family out of that town. Start fresh." Daniel felt a pang of understanding. Samuel had been driven by a desire to protect his family, to give them a new beginning, but in the end, It had only forced them further into isolation. Did he ever talk about his family after he left? Tony nodded, his gaze distant. All the time, especially about his little sister, Margaret. He loved her, wanted her to have a good life. I think he kept his distance to protect them, you know? Like he thought he was bad luck, and if he stayed away, they'd be safe. It was a heartbreaking thought, and Daniel felt his chest tighten. Samuel had sacrificed his own happiness, his own connection to his family, in the hope of giving them a better life, a life free from his mistakes. When Daniel returned to Margaret's apartment that evening, he was greeted by Sophie, who hugged him as soon as he walked in. "Did you find something?" she asked, her eyes wide with curiosity. "Yes, I did," he replied softly, glancing at Margaret, who was watching him intently. They all sat down, and Daniel took a deep breath, preparing to share everything he'd learned. "Margaret, Samuel left to protect you. He thought that by leaving, he was sparing your family from the shame of what had happened," he explained, his voice steady but gentle. "He wanted you to have a better life, a life where you weren't held back by his mistakes. And he carried that with him for the rest of his life." Margaret's face crumpled, and she covered her mouth with one hand, tears spilling down her cheeks. Sophie wrapped her arms around her grandmother, holding her close. "So he really did care," Margaret whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "He didn't forget us. He didn't abandon us. No, he didn't," Daniel said softly. "He loved you all very much, and that love carried on, even after he was gone. It's still here, in Sophie, in you. It's a part of who you are." Margaret looked at Sophie, a new light in her eyes. "We're part of him," she murmured, smiling through her tears. "And he'll always be a part of us." As Daniel rose to leave, he felt a profound sense of peace settle over him. He had done more than just uncover a story. He had helped a family reclaim its history, its pride, and its love. And he knew, as he looked back at Margaret and Sophie, that he had been forever changed by their journey. The days after Daniel's visit were quiet for Margaret and Sophie, as they absorbed the truth Daniel had uncovered. The revelation about Samuel's life, his struggles, and his sacrifices settled deeply within them, filling gaps in their family history that had once seemed unbridgeable. Yet, Margaret couldn't shake the sense that there was still more to learn, more closure to be found. One evening, as Margaret sat by the window, lost in thought, Sophie climbed onto the arm of her chair and snuggled close. "Gran, do you think Samuel would have wanted us to know all this?" she asked softly, her young face earnest. Margaret wrapped an arm around her granddaughter, her gaze distant. "Yes, I think he would, sweetheart. I think he would have wanted us to understand why he did what he did, and to know that he loved us, even if he couldn't be with us." Sophie nodded solemnly. She had listened carefully to everything Daniel had explained, her young mind absorbing more than Margaret had realized. Sophie was quiet for a long moment, then looked up at her grandmother, her expression determined. "Then maybe we should find his resting place. You know, like a place to remember him." Margaret's heart ached at the thought. She hadn't considered it before, but Sophie's words struck a chord deep within her. She wanted that too, a place where she could go to remember Samuel, to honor him. Perhaps Daniel could help them with this final piece of closure. The next day, Margaret called Daniel and asked if he could assist in finding Samuel's final resting place. Daniel, sensing the significance of the request, immediately agreed. Over the following days, he dedicated himself to the task, combing through every record, cross-referencing every lead. His efforts finally bore fruit. Samuel's remains had been interred in a modest cemetery on the outskirts of the city, under an unmarked stone. It was a quiet, unremarkable spot, and Daniel felt a pang of sadness at the thought that Samuel had been laid to rest without the presence of family, without even his name on the stone. He called Margaret that evening, and they arranged to meet at the cemetery the next day. As he hung up, he felt the weight of what this journey had become. It wasn't just a search for answers anymore. It was a pilgrimage, a chance to bring Samuel home to the family that had never stopped loving him. The next morning, Daniel drove Margaret and Sophie to the cemetery. They rode in silence, each of them lost in thought, bracing themselves for what lay ahead. The streets were empty, the city still quiet in the early hours. As they pulled into the cemetery, the sky was a soft gray, clouds heavy with the promise of rain. They walked through the rows of headstones, Margaret's hand resting on Sophie's shoulder, both of them looking small and fragile amid the sprawling expanse of graves. Daniel led them to the unmarked stone he had found, pausing a few feet away to give them space. Margaret approached the stone slowly, her fingers brushing over its cool, rough surface. She knelt, placing one hand on the earth, a shiver running through her as though she could feel Samuel's presence beneath her fingertips. She closed her eyes, her mind flooding with memories of her brother. The mischievous grin he'd worn as a child, the way he teased her mercilessly but had always been there to protect her when she needed him. Her heart felt both full and heavy, a complex mix of love and regret. "Oh, Samuel," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I wish I'd known. I wish I'd been there for you." Her shoulders shook as she let out a long, quiet sob, the years of grief and longing finally finding release. Sophie knelt beside her, her small hand resting on the stone. She looked up at her grandmother, her young face serious. "Gran, he knows we're here now, doesn't he?" Margaret nodded, her hand still on the earth. "Yes, he knows, darling." She smiled through her tears, taking comfort in the thought. "And he knows we never stopped loving him." Sophie sat quietly, her gaze on the ground as she seemed to contemplate this. After a moment, she reached into her pocket and pulled out a small, worn photograph. It was the only one they had of Samuel, faded and creased, with his face barely visible. Sophie placed it gently on the grave, pressing it down so the wind wouldn't carry it away. "I thought he might like to see us," she whispered, glancing up at her grandmother. Margaret wrapped an arm around Sophie, pulling her close. "I think he would like that very much." They stayed there for a long time, the air heavy with the weight of what they had finally found. A place to honor Samuel, a connection they could return to when they needed to feel close to him. Daniel stood nearby, giving them their privacy but keeping a respectful vigil. He watched as Margaret and Sophie shared quiet words, tears, and finally, a sense of peace. He was struck by the beauty of the moment, by the resilience of the love they had carried for Samuel through all the years of silence and separation. Eventually, Margaret rose, taking one last look at the stone before turning to Daniel. Her face was calm, her expression one of quiet gratitude. "Thank you, Daniel," she said, her voice steady. "Thank you for bringing us here, for giving us this chance to say goodbye." Daniel nodded, feeling a lump rise in his throat. "It was my honor, Margaret," he replied quietly. "Samuel deserved to be remembered, and you both deserve to find him." They began the walk back to the car, the silence between them now peaceful, the weight of their journey lighter than it had been. As they reached the gate, Margaret stopped and looked back at the cemetery, a gentle smile on her lips. She felt as though a part of her had been laid to rest along with Samuel, a part that had longed for closure, for understanding. Now, she could carry on, knowing he was finally at peace. Sophie glanced up at her grandmother. "Gran, can we come back sometime? Just to visit him?" Margaret nodded, her hand on Sophie's shoulder. "Of course, darling. We'll come back whenever you like. He'll always be here, waiting for us." They drove home quietly, each of them lost in their thoughts. When they arrived back at the apartment, Daniel lingered at the door, sensing that their journey together had come to a natural close. He looked at Margaret and Sophie, feeling an overwhelming sense of respect for their strength, for the way they had carried their love and resilience through everything. "Will we see you again, Mr. Brooks?" Sophie asked, her eyes bright with curiosity and affection. Daniel smiled, kneeling to meet her gaze. "You can call me Daniel, and yes, I think you'll see me again. After all, I still need to check in on my two favorite clients." Margaret chuckled softly, her eyes filled with warmth. "You've done more for us than you know, Daniel. You've given us something we can never repay." Daniel shook his head. "It was never about repayment, Margaret. Sometimes, the best things we do in life aren't for money or recognition. They're just for love." With a final nod, he turned and walked away, feeling the weight of their journey settle within him, but in a way that brought him peace rather than burden. He knew he would never forget Margaret and Sophie, nor the resilience they had shown as they sought to reclaim the lost threads of their family. In the days that followed, Daniel found himself reflecting often on the time he'd spent with them. Their story stayed with him, a reminder of the importance of family, of the connections that endure despite time, distance, and even death. And he felt that somehow, through helping them, he'd found a part of himself he hadn't even realized was missing. He returned to his work, his cases, his usual life. But he carried with him a newfound sense of purpose, a quiet resolve to seek meaning beyond the surface of his daily routine. He stayed in touch with Margaret and Sophie, occasionally visiting them, sharing stories over cups of tea, watching as Sophie grew into a young girl who understood the strength of her family's legacy. And every so often, when he found a moment to himself, he would drive back to that cemetery on the outskirts of the city. He would sit by Samuel's grave, laying a small flower or a stone on the unmarked headstone, knowing that he wasn't alone, that Margaret and Sophie, too, carried Samuel's memory with them. In time, Margaret arranged to have Samuel's name added to the stone, a final tribute to the brother she had loved and the man who had sacrificed so much for his family. And every year, on the anniversary of their visit, she and Sophie would return to that quiet cemetery, a small bouquet of flowers in hand, knowing that Samuel's memory would live on, in their hearts and in the family they had fought so hard to reclaim. The seasons changed, and with each passing month, Margaret and Sophie continued to find their way forward, though the memory of Samuel lingered with them like a soft, persistent hum. They honored his memory with quiet acts of remembrance, keeping his story alive in their conversations and visits to the cemetery. Daniel, true to his word, stayed in their lives, visiting them often and becoming a familiar face in their apartment, an unofficial part of their family. One chilly autumn evening, as leaves turned shades of amber and gold, Daniel stopped by their apartment for dinner. Sophie had taken a liking to these visits, and Margaret had prepared one of her best dishes, a stew recipe she said Samuel had loved as a child. The meal was cozy, filled with laughter and stories. Margaret had a special glow that night, her spirit lighter than he'd seen before. After dinner, as they gathered in the small living room, Sophie turned to Daniel with a question that had been growing in her mind. "Daniel," she began, her eyes wide and curious, "do you have a family like ours?" Daniel was taken aback, but he saw only innocence in her gaze. Margaret looked over at him, an understanding smile on her face, knowing that Sophie's questions often struck at the heart of things. "Well, Sophie," he said, carefully choosing his words, "I have family, but not like yours. My parents live out west, and I don't see them often. I work a lot, so it's hard to make time to visit." Sophie tilted her head, a thoughtful look crossing her face. "So, does that mean we're kind of like family too?" Daniel chuckled softly, touched by her straightforwardness. "Yes, I think it does," he replied. "You two have become like family to me." Margaret's eyes softened, and she reached out, placing a gentle hand on his arm. "You know, Daniel, you've given us more than we ever could have asked for. And not just with finding Samuel. You've brought kindness and companionship back into our lives. I want you to know that we're here for you too." Daniel felt a warmth settle over him, a kind of peace he hadn't felt in years. It was as though this family, fractured and yet resilient, had filled a quiet void within him, reminding him of what it meant to be connected, to be part of something larger than himself. They talked late into the night, the conversation meandering through lighthearted stories and poignant reflections. As the hour grew late, Daniel reluctantly prepared to leave. Sophie, tired but unwilling to let him go, gave him a hug, and Margaret saw him to the door. Before he stepped out, Margaret placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Daniel, you don't have to be a stranger. You've become part of this family, whether you meant to or not." Daniel looked at her, feeling the sincerity in her words. "Thank you, Margaret. That means more to me than you know." The weeks that followed brought new routines and fresh beginnings. Daniel's life, once so neatly compartmentalized between work and solitude, had softened, making space for something more. He found himself stopping by Margaret and Sophie's apartment more frequently, bringing small gifts for Sophie, listening to Margaret's stories, and even finding ways to involve them in his world. He'd take Sophie to a bookstore on weekends, indulging her love of mystery novels, or bring over takeout from different restaurants for them to try. One evening, Daniel received a call from Margaret. She sounded excited, almost breathless, as she asked if he could come over. There was something she wanted to share with him. Intrigued, he agreed, making his way to their apartment after work. When he arrived, he found Sophie and Margaret seated around the small kitchen table, a stack of old, faded letters spread before them. Margaret looked up, her face radiant with excitement. "Daniel, you won't believe what we found," she said, motioning for him to join them at the table. "I was cleaning out an old box in the closet, and I found these letters." She carefully lifted one of the letters, its edges frayed and the ink faded. "They're from Samuel." Daniel's eyes widened as he leaned in to examine the letters. Margaret carefully opened one, handling it as though it might fall apart in her hands. She began to read aloud, her voice trembling with emotion as she brought Samuel's words to life. The letters were filled with small details, moments from Samuel's life after he'd left, his struggles and reflections, his longing to reconnect with his family but his fear that he had let them down. He wrote about his attempts to make a fresh start, his regrets, and his dreams of someday being forgiven. Margaret's voice grew softer as she read, tears pooling in her eyes as she absorbed the words her brother had written so many years ago. In one letter, Samuel had written, "I've done things I'm not proud of, things I can't undo. But please know, Margaret, that I never stopped loving you. Not for a single moment. I left because I thought it was the only way to protect you. I hope someday you'll understand." Margaret paused, her hand covering her mouth as she took in the weight of his words. Daniel reached over, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder, giving her a moment to collect herself. Sophie sat quietly, her young face reflecting a deep empathy for her grandmother's pain. Margaret took a steadying breath and continued reading. "I thought leaving would set things right, that it would give you a chance to live free of my mistakes. But it only left me empty, Margaret. I hope someday I can find the courage to come back and make amends, to look you in the eye and ask for forgiveness." The letter ended on that note, with Samuel's hope left unfinished, unfulfilled. Margaret's hands shook as she set the letter down, a look of both sorrow and acceptance on her face. "All these years," she whispered, "he was carrying that burden, and I never knew. I never knew he was trying to find his way back." Daniel felt a profound sense of awe at the resilience of this family, the quiet strength that had carried them through years of uncertainty and separation. The letters were a gift, a testament to Samuel's love, his regrets, and his humanity. He'd been flawed, yes, but he had also been driven by love, by a desire to protect his family in the only way he knew how. Over the next several hours, Margaret and Daniel read through the remaining letters, each one a window into Samuel's life, his thoughts, his inner struggles. By the time they finished, the room was filled with a quiet peace, a sense of closure that had eluded Margaret for so long. As they sat together, Daniel felt the depth of his bond with this family, a bond that had grown beyond mere friendship. He realized that Margaret and Sophie had given him something invaluable, a sense of purpose, a connection that went beyond his work, beyond his solitary life. That night, as he left their apartment, he felt a warmth in his heart, a certainty that he had found something rare and beautiful. Margaret and Sophie were no longer just his clients. They were his family, a family bound not by blood, but by a shared journey, by love and resilience and forgiveness. The following weekend, Daniel returned with a surprise. He had arranged for a small plaque to be added to Samuel's grave, a marker that bore his name and a simple message: "Beloved son, brother, and uncle, forever in our hearts." When Margaret and Sophie saw it, they were overcome with emotion, and they stood in silence for a long moment, each of them placing a hand on the cool stone, as though to share one final connection with the man they had loved and lost. As they stood together, Daniel realized that this was the legacy Samuel had left behind, a family that had endured, a love that had survived even the greatest distances, and he felt, for the first time in years, that he had truly found his place among them, that he, too, was part of this legacy. Margaret turned to him, her eyes filled with gratitude. Thank you, Daniel, for everything. He nodded, his own eyes misty. Thank you, Margaret. You've given me more than I could ever give back. And as they left the cemetery that day, Daniel knew that he had found a new purpose, a new family, and a place in a story that would continue to be told. A story of love, forgiveness, and the power of family to heal even the deepest wounds. The days slipped by, turning into weeks, then months, and Margaret, Sophie, and Daniel settled into a new rhythm. They were no longer just bound by their shared journey, but by a lasting friendship that had grown from trust, respect, and a quiet but profound love. Life in Margaret and Sophie's small apartment was brighter now, filled with moments of laughter and warmth. Daniel visited regularly, no longer the distant lawyer they'd once known, but a fixture in their lives, a steadfast presence they could rely on, a friend who had become family. As autumn drew to a close, Margaret suggested that they do something special to celebrate the first holiday season since discovering the truth about Samuel. She wanted it to be a time to honor him, to celebrate his memory, and to cherish the family she'd found again, both in Sophie and in Daniel. She planned a modest dinner and invited Daniel to join them, and he accepted with a sense of joy that surprised even himself. On a chilly December evening, he arrived, his arms filled with flowers, a bottle of wine, and a small, carefully wrapped gift for Sophie. The apartment was filled with the comforting aroma of a homemade meal, and Sophie, wearing a bright holiday dress, ran to greet him with excitement. Margaret welcomed him warmly, her face glowing with the happiness that seemed to have bloomed anew since their journey had reached its end. As they gathered around the small table, set with care and decorated with a few sprigs of evergreen Sophie had found at a park, they shared a meal filled with the comfort of friendship and familiarity. They laughed over stories, some new and some old. Margaret shared memories of her childhood with Samuel, filling in gaps she hadn't remembered before. Sophie listened eagerly, asking questions and delighting in the stories of the uncle she'd never known but felt she understood more deeply than ever. After dinner, as they cleared the table, Sophie tugged on Daniel's sleeve, her face alight with curiosity. "Daniel, can we play the game you taught me?" she asked, her eyes wide with anticipation. Daniel laughed, agreeing immediately. He had introduced her to an old board game he'd played as a child, and she'd taken to it with the same determination and spirit she brought to everything. They set up the game in the living room while Margaret sat nearby, watching with a soft smile, her heart full at the sight of her granddaughter so at ease, her life so different from the uncertainty she'd once known. As they played, Sophie's competitive side emerged, and Daniel feigned exasperation, throwing up his hands dramatically as she outmaneuvered him. The room filled with laughter, with Sophie's giggles and Daniel's good-natured grumbling. Margaret's gaze drifted between them, her heart warmed by the sight of the family they had become. When the game ended, Sophie the triumphant victor, Margaret brought out a small box, wrapped in simple paper and tied with a red ribbon. She handed it to Daniel, her eyes warm with gratitude. "This is for you," she said quietly, "to thank you for all you've done for us." Daniel looked at her, a flicker of surprise crossing his face. He hadn't expected anything, certainly not a gift, but he accepted it, touched by the gesture. As he carefully unwrapped the paper, he found inside a small, framed photo, a family photo from when Margaret had been just a young girl, standing beside her parents and Samuel. They looked so happy, their faces bright with smiles, and Daniel felt a pang of something indescribable as he looked at it. Margaret spoke softly. "I thought you should have a piece of him too. You gave us so much of him back, Daniel. You helped us find him. It feels right that you should have something of him as well." He swallowed, feeling the depth of her gesture, the connection it symbolized. "Thank you, Margaret," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I'll cherish this." They sat in silence for a moment, each of them caught in their own memories, feeling the weight of all they had gone through together. Then Sophie broke the quiet, her voice hesitant but filled with a child's unwavering sincerity. "Daniel, I'm really glad you're part of our family now." Daniel looked at her, his heart swelling with emotion. He reached over and took her hand, giving it a gentle squeeze. "I'm glad too, Sophie. I'm grateful every day." As the night wore on, they shared more stories, more laughter, until the hours grew late and sleepiness began to creep in. Sophie, her energy finally spent, curled up on the couch, her head resting on Daniel's arm. He sat there quietly, not wanting to disturb her, feeling a profound sense of peace settle over him. Margaret watched them, her eyes brimming with gratitude and contentment. She felt as though Samuel himself had sent Daniel into their lives, as if he had orchestrated this journey from afar, knowing they would need someone to help them find each other again. When it was finally time for Daniel to leave, he carefully lifted Sophie, carrying her to her room and tucking her in under her blankets. She stirred only briefly, giving him a sleepy smile before drifting back to sleep. As he closed her door softly, he felt a sense of belonging that went beyond words. Margaret walked him to the door, wrapping a shawl around herself to ward off the evening chill. They stood together in the quiet hallway, an understanding passing between them. "Thank you, Daniel," she said softly, "for everything. You've given us a gift that can never be repaid." He shook his head, a warm smile on his face. "You don't owe me anything, Margaret. I'm the one who's grateful. You and Sophie. You've given me more than I ever expected." They stood there for a moment, comfortable in the silence, in the shared knowledge that they were forever bound by this journey. Then, with a final hug, Daniel said goodnight and walked down the hall, glancing back once to see Margaret watching him, a soft smile on her face. As he drove home, the streets quiet and the city lights casting a warm glow, he felt a profound sense of fulfillment. He had started this journey as a lawyer on a case, but he was leaving it as something far more: a friend, a family member, a man who had found a place he hadn't known he'd been searching for. In the days that followed, life continued on, steady and certain. Margaret and Sophie visited Samuel's grave regularly, laying flowers and talking to him as though he were there with them. They honored him not with sadness, but with joy, with the memories they had reclaimed and the love they shared. Daniel continued to visit, each time welcomed like family, each time feeling the same warmth and sense of belonging. He saw Sophie grow, watched as Margaret's smile became a permanent fixture on her face, as though a weight had been lifted from her soul. Together, they created new memories, shared new stories, and strengthened the bond that had brought them together. Years later, on a quiet evening much like the one when he'd first joined them for dinner, Daniel found himself reflecting on how much his life had changed. He had built a family, not through blood, but through love and shared experiences. He knew, as he sat surrounded by these people he loved, that he was exactly where he was meant to be. The story of Samuel, Margaret, and Sophie would live on, not only in memories, but in the family they had forged through resilience, forgiveness, and unbreakable love. And as Daniel looked around the room, filled with warmth and laughter, he knew that they had all found what they had been searching for: a place to call home and people to call family.